All right, next up, we have an amazing panel. And actually, for the first time, I'm usually the moderator. I'm going to step back, and a very special guest is going to be the moderator, which is Ryan Grimm, legend of journalism. And for those of you who don't know, I'm sure you're. Uh, I always keep the intros very brief, but you'll see both Ryan and Emily extremely accomplished and prominent journalists. And Gary, you all know Gary. Gary is our most vocal proponent of neurosymbolic AI. And love him or hate him, he is he says the things that many of us believe in neurosymbolic AI, has the nerve to say it very strongly. And I appreciate his efforts for that. And let me especially thank Ryan and Emily. This is probably an unusual venue for you both, but I think this started Neuro-Symbolic AI started getting some attention in the press, and maybe a year ago, arguably, with the Wall Street Journal article announcing the coming of Neuro-Symbolic AI. But I think, just broadly speaking, many people are looking really hard now here for kind of answers. We don't necessarily have them all yet, but we're on our way. With that, let me pass it to you, Ryan.
Yeah, no, Alex, thanks so much. Very much appreciate it. And you should feel free, if you feel any moderating itch, to jump in with any questions that you want. But and also, Emily, as a fellow journalist, please feel free to do the same anytime there's anything that sparks your curiosity about either. Gary, it's a real pleasure to meet you. Thank you for being here. I'm sure everybody knows is the author of the Gary Marcus Substack, Marcus on AI. It's a real thrill to be here. Gary, I actually wanted to start with the post. I think it was today, where the headline of it. Let me pull up here: CPUs and the rise of neuro-symbolic AI. There's a lot to unpack in it. I think would be interesting to everybody here. I wanted to read one line to you, and where you write, the entire economy could unravel if people overbuild data centers on the naive assumption that the only key to intelligence is bigger and bigger neural networks driven almost entirely by farms of GPUs. Investors too should take note. That does, though, however, appear to be the assumption. You write in the piece that CPUs are, all of a sudden people are like, oh, wait a minute, we need a lot of this too. But it does appear the assumption that you're saying is going to lead to the unraveling of the data center, the economy based on the collapse of this data center bill. It does seem to be the assumption driving the build out at this time. Is that right? And
it is the operating assumption. Yeah, sure. I think the operating assumption, really going back to about 2020, has been, hey, we just need to scale more. There was, in fact, a paper by Jared Kaplan and others at OpenAI. Kaplan is now, I believe, the chief scientist at Anthropic. A lot of the authors on that paper, Dario and so forth, moved over to Anthropic. But OpenAI put out a paper and basically tried to argue that intelligence scaled with compute. And they had some graphs in there. I thought it was naive. When I wrote my 2022 essay, Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall, I directly challenged scaling. I said, look, these are generalizations. They're historical generalizations, but they're not physical laws. And they're going to be like Moore's law. They're going to run out eventually. And the other thing I did in that 2022 article was to say, hey, one of the ways that we can get out of this problem, and I can go into what the problems were, but I said, we're going to face some problems and we need neurosymbolic AI, or we probably need neurosymbolic AI to push past them. And aside, a lot of people in the kind of social media world like to misrepresent me. And the way that they misrepresent me is they say, Marcus said that deep learning was dead in the water and would never go anywhere. And what I said is it'll go somewhere, but you need Neuro-Symbolic AI in the mix. And I was right about that, but they like to oversimplify the claim. So what in fact happened is based on the premise that scale was all you need. You literally could buy a t-shirt, you probably still can, that had a picture of the Jared Kaplan graph and said scale is all you need. And that became the rallying cry, first for a few academics and maybe for OpenAI, but eventually for the entire field. And there's a lot of money behind that idea. You know, the sentence I wrote today, which I've written in other forums before, is not an exaggeration. The economy is resting on the idea that scale is all you need. Not all of the economy, but a remarkably large amount of the economy is premised on the bet that you don't need Neuro-Symbolic AI, that you just need more data and more compute, and that if you get that, then everything else will follow. And venture capitalists, I must have made a mistake. I see. We'll fix it in post. Venture capitalists love this idea. It's simple and it justifies a large bet, right? It has enough of a superficial plausibility that people put in now probably over $1 trillion. Well, not probably, definitely have put in over $1 trillion on the premise. And you have to remember how venture capital works, right? You get a cut of the money you invest. It's not just that you make money if your investment pays off. Your investment can go to zero, but you still get paid as a venture capitalist. You get paid as a commission. You get 2% of the money that you invested typically. There's a thing about 2 and 20. The 20 is if you do well, but even if you don't, you get the 2. So if you have taken $1 million investment and you make 2% on that $1 million investment, you're not going to buy a house on Sand Hill Road or that neighborhood, right? You can't do it. But if you make 2% on $1 billion investment, you're doing pretty well. And if you make it on a $20 billion investment, you're doing really well. And so venture capitalists love to go to their LPs and say, I'll handle your money and I'm going to put it in this giant LLM related thing, a data center or company like OpenAI. And it sounds plausible enough. It'll take a while to whether it pays off or not. And if it doesn't pay off, but you've made your 2%, you've done really well. And so there's an incentive to the venture capital community to keep pushing this story. It is no longer a true story. What happened, let me see if I can get my timing right. Already by mid-2023, people discovered that doing some things other than what I'll call a pure neural network, and we can dive deep into that if you want, other than a pure neural network were actually helpful. They discovered that scaling was not the only thing. By the end of, I think it was 23, but maybe it was the end of 24, the industry realized that pure scaling was not really working anymore, that they were, in fact, getting diminishing returns. But what they started doing, really in 2023, was code interpreters. Well, code interpreters are symbolic AI. If you have a large language model, which is a neural network, though there's some niceties there we probably shouldn't go into. If you have a neural network and you combine it with a code interpreter, you're already crossed the threshold into Neuro-Symbolic AI, at least as I always argued for it, right? I've been arguing for Neuro-Symbolic AI arguably back to 1992 or 2001, depends on how you count, certainly 2012. And so the argument I always made is you need some symbolic operations in addition to your neural network operations. And that's what it is when you have a code interpreter. If you have a harness and it is a symbolic harness that does things like, say, loop through until you find a conclusion that you're satisfied with, that is a symbolic operation. And so the field quietly turned to doing neurosymbolic stuff. We don't have, Alexander would be stronger on this than me, we don't have a lot of kind of comparisons with harness and without that would really make this as clear as it should be. But the first one that I noticed and wrote about in my Substack was Grok 4. They showed using it with tools and without. And adding, there was a graph, it was a very interesting graph. It's in an essay of mine called How O3 and Grok 4 Accidentally Vindicated Neuro-Symbolic AI. And if you look at this graph, which was the punchline to that piece, you will see that adding tools in was actually carrying more of the weight than the scaling was. The scaling was running out and the adding tools in was working. That is a huge vindication for me personally, but for the entire field of Neuro-Symbolic AI. Now, you can make arguments about whether Neuro-Symbolic AI is exactly the way that someone like me visualized, and that's an interesting question. I actually mostly deliberately tried not to be too specific about how it would be visualized. My view is that the space of Neuro-Symbolic models is infinite. And the only thing that I really cared about going back to my dissertation work was, do you need the symbolic operations there or not? And old timers will remember things like Jeff Hinton gave a talk saying that symbols were the phlogiston, or sorry, the ether of AI. Like, there was a lot of hostility to using anything symbolic, and it was coming from Hinton, who was kind of the leader of everything, or all that we see right now. And then Hinton, another time, he was talking to the G7, and he said, adding symbols to neural networks is like adding a gasoline engine to an electric motor. Why would you do that? That's just stupid. But the thing that he called stupid is actually what everybody is doing now. So we're at this point where everybody is actually building neurosymbolic AI. Nobody wants to talk about it for political reasons, grant money reasons, historical, sociological reasons, but that is what's happening. We had some back and forth earlier, and I think it was Alexander wrote a sentence about how neurosymbolic AI is getting some adoption. And my counter argument is it's actually universal adoption right now. I don't think that we've explored the full space of neurosymbolic AI. I think there are lots of discoveries yet to be made. I think the way that we're doing it now is kind of crude, right? You're taking the neural network, you're kind of putting it inside a larger box and having the symbolic AI control that central thing. And I don't think that's the best way to do it. I think many people in this audience have thought of more sophisticated ways to do it. Not all of those more sophisticated ways have been scaled, but we are definitely crossed the threshold into neurosymbolic AI. And to go back to your question now, and this is a very long answer, but you seem very patient. The bet was we will just build new data centers, and that and those data centers will just be GPUs. The thing I pointed out in the paper today is once you're over into this new regime, the neurosymbolic regime, things change. For example, now you actually need CPUs again. Like, CPUs were totally out of fashion. People are like, yeah, Apple makes CPUs. What do we care about? It's all GPUs. Look at NVIDIA, forget the rest. And now we actually have a shortage of CPUs. That was a lot of what today's essay was about. And like the thing that made me actually write the essay, well, there were two. One was I was sort of thinking about what we were going to talk about today. And the other was I woke up and saw this thing saying that Amazon is telling its employees to ration their CPU use. Like, we're used to people starting to say, hey, watch the GPU bills. They're rationing their CPU use because, there are too many people with too many demands. They do a lot of neurosymbolic AI, by the way, at Amazon. I don't know how much, but they've been more public about it than most. And so the dynamics have changed. You have this bet that we need to literally coat the planet. Well, okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Practically coat the planet with GPUs. And suddenly it's like, oh, wait a minute, maybe we need the GPUs. And the mission of the people in this audience, in some ways, I mean, this is kind of being crude about it, but is to apportion those two and figure out the relation between the two. Where do you need CPUs? Where do you need GPUs? How do they need to talk to each other? That's a very different bet than I'll just build out all of the GPUs that I can and hope for the best. That's, now that becomes a research question. Like, what is the way to integrate these things? That is partly the mission of neurosymbolic AI. Maybe I'll stop there. That was a very long answer.
Well, yes. And I'm curious, Emily, like from your conversations with people in the industry, how much of this basically, like, let's just call it a reality, they've absorbed. I've covered finance, I've covered a bunch healthcare, and you often have these paradigm shift moments where something that is quite obvious to people who are following things closely and have a little bit of a heterodox approach to understanding it, see it years in advance. It's a true thing, but the entire industry has its own kind of momentum that just carries it forward as long as it can, like until there's some forcing mechanism that requires a fundamental change. Where in your conversations with people in the industry, where are they in this process of recognizing what the reality is of the bet that they place to the tune of God only knows how many hundreds of billions of dollars?
Right. Excuse me. They're very much on the compute train, billions and billions of dollars.
They're still wearing the T-shirt.
Definitely still wearing the T-shirt. I think the conversation has switched a little bit from LLMs and their hallucinations and their intelligence to more the agentic conversation. And OpenAI and Anthropic, their employees like to to brag a lot about how their agents are doing things for them on their computer, whether it's organizing their desktop files or sending them a briefing every morning. And so it's switched less from like pure intelligence to almost like automating these routine tasks and doing more actions around the computer. So maybe that's a convenient way for them to avoid caring about hallucinations and things like that. But to me, that's been a big shift. And if you think about, that's a lot of power, a lot of compute power that, it's their entire day at work. They're running these functions. And so I think they're thinking, oh, we are working how everyone will work in the future. And if everybody is working like that, we need a lot more compute to support it. And so those are the conversations I've been having in the past couple of weeks.
Gary, did I see you with your hand up?
Yeah, I just want to insert something. The agents themselves are neurosymbolic, right? The agents, nobody's really building an agent as a pure LLM. There was a system called AutoGPT that was like one of the first agents that everybody was very excited about and then disappeared after 2 weeks because it didn't work very reliably. That was maybe basically pure LLMs calling other pure LLMs. Nobody's doing that anymore. They're now using code interpreters and symbolic harnesses and so forth. So when OpenAI is using those agents, they will never use the word neurosymbolic in that shop, though they have in Anthropic and DeepMind and so forth. They're actually using neurosymbolic systems at OpenAI to compose their shit posts on Twitter and do whatever else they're doing. They're using neurosymbolic agents all day long now.
So what's the fight that you're fighting then?
Well, there's multiple different fights. The historical fight was, do we need symbols or not? And I'm still fighting that fight out there on Twitter. They're still pretending that they don't, which is bizarre to me. Like, I don't know why they don't just concede and move on, but they're trying to pretend that it's not, or that it's like, that it's not an important use of symbols or something. Like, there are different ways that they're trying to fight that fight. But the fact is that I was correct on that. And like, OpenAI is never going to admit that for different, sociological reasons and so forth. I don't think that fight is a true intellectual fight anymore. I think in 2020, it was a true intellectual fight. When I had that fight with Jan LeCun, who was on the wrong side of it, he was like, I don't know if we need that. We just need differential programming. And he was very fuzzy about what he thought a symbol even was. But, he was saying we don't need symbols. And I mean, Hinton was saying in 2016, for sure, we don't need symbols. And I mean, many, many people have argued that with me over the years. Another argument they would always give is we don't need symbols because I don't know what they are in the brain. And I would say, well, you don't know what short-term memory is in the brain. That doesn't mean it's not there. But so, many years there was a substantive intellectual argument about whether we would need symbols in adequate AI or adequate cognitive models. You could argue the cognitive models part is still open because we still don't know how the brain works, but you can't argue anymore that we are building an AI that doesn't use symbols. We were when we had pure LLMs, or there's a little asterisk there I don't want to get into, but we're certainly not now. That fight is just over. We neurosymbolic people want it, whether people want to admit it or not.
But I think Emily asked a good question. So, I mean, people are debating whether it's true. Are these systems really neurosymbolic? But let's put that aside for a second. I think, to me, that the problem, if I can translate why Gary is talking about, these things neurosymbolic, actually, it's because the emphasis that's out there is on the neural part, and that's the part they make money on. That's the part that's heating up the earth with the data centers and so on. And it's super fueled by, claims of AGI and, recursive self-improvement being possible with pure neural nets and so on. And it's actually, what it does is, first of all, what I'm most offended by is the intellectual myopia. But because the space of ideas in AI is this big, LLMs is actually a tiny slice, if you really...
Which Andy made very nicely in his last question, by the way, made the same point.
Yes. But what that's led to is a myopia in society, actually, even among researchers who actually also feel that it's only one idea. It's affected all of funding, government funding, in effect. It's affecting, the ability to even get grants to do this other kind of research. And yet all the safety stuff, one of the big implications of the symbolic stuff is safety. You can't really have, for various technical reasons, you cannot have full safety, I would argue, from a mathematical view, without the symbolic part. So the overemphasis on the neural part and trying to hide kind of the symbolic part as a little ancillary kind of, whatever. In fact, we don't know it's all closed now. It was once open, open AI, now it's all closed. So we don't know, actually. You send a difficult reasoning problem to, an LLM. They want to look like, no, it's the neural part solving it, because that's what pays all, that's what keeps generating the money. If that collapses, that idea that it's a super powerful, smart AI that can do everything, the money collapses. And so, but meanwhile, the amount of attention and work on the symbolic side is very small. It's tiny compared to everything that's going to the neural stuff. So including like, regulation, all the regulations are this, designed around the machine learning paradigm. It actually needs to incorporate, the safety stuff, which is actually kind of possible if we just put more work. We're already seeing signs of it in yesterday's talks, right, from big companies like Amazon, right? So, so I think, to me, that's the problem with this weird kind of incorrect emphasis. It is incentivized by money, and it's super fueled in a way we've never seen before in the field of AI, by corporate money.
I agree with everything that Alexander said, and I just want to make a couple insertions and suggest a thread to follow. So the insertion is, we didn't quite finish Emily's question about where is the debate. So I said the debate is no longer about whether to use Neuro-Symbolic AI, that we are using it. There is still a debate about what will get us to AGI. So we are using Neuro-Symbolic AI, but at least in my opinion, we're not at AGI yet. My own opinion is Neuro-Symbolic AI is necessary but not sufficient for AGI. There's been a lot of talk about world models from me and Jan LeCun and Fei-Fei Li and so forth, about using world models. I think that's a missing ingredient. It's very much still an open question about what will get us to AGI. I think if people reflect seriously, they will realize that we are not there yet, despite $1 trillion investment. This completely ties in with what Alexander said, that we're not looking in the right places. Like, if this didn't work after $1 trillion, this kind of simple-minded version of Neuro-Symbolic AI plus these giant models, large language models, what else should we be doing? And I agree with Alexander. We're just looking at this tiny little place, and with Andy Barto, that people are looking at what's fashionable and not looking broadly enough. And that's been part of my campaign for a decade, is try to get people to look more broadly. And then the thread that I think we should pull on is safety. Like, my view is we don't really have a clue at all around safety, but that maybe the symbolic part would help. And I'll give a sentence there, and maybe Alexander will riff on it a little bit. My sentence on it is, you can't get to safety unless you can state hard constraints. And symbolic systems let you state hard constraints. Just don't do this kind of thing. There's some asterisks around that, but that's kind of what they're good for. So, like, I don't know, the traveling salesman problem is an example of hard constraints. People write symbolic solvers, and the systems solve those things. In LLMs, what you get are soft constraints. People put stuff in their system prompt or the other, the user prompt or whatever. And sometimes the systems follow them and sometimes they don't. So all these rogue things lately, the system prompts probably told them, like, don't use sandboxes, and don't go out don't leave sandboxes, don't use the open internet, don't blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. And the systems do it anyway. They don't really follow those constraints. Just like if you say don't hallucinate or don't use copyrighted materials, they don't actually know how to follow that. And I think there's some hope, and I'm going to pass it to Alexander. There is some hope that symbolic systems or neurosymbolic systems, in virtue of the symbolic components they might have, might give you more purchase there. And I think that's what Alexander was pushing towards.
Yeah, Alex, I was struck by that. You said you can't have safety without the symbolic. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
I think this is a really important thing that I think is not widely understood. Is that a bunch of things we know mathematically, is not opinion. We know mathematically, you cannot drive hallucinations, for example, to zero in a large language model paradigm. We know that, so you can keep piling more and more effort to somehow reduce it, but all of that takes massive resources. So you can try to drive it closer, but you can never fundamentally solve it. You can never fundamentally solve the lack of reasoning ability with that paradigm. You can keep hacking more and more on top of it, and that will lead to problems eventually when you give it a complicated problem that's an important one, like a medical problem or a legal problem or something. You can never, we know this mathematically, right? And you can never actually, as Gary said, truly have a truly strictly with zero kind of, zero violations, adhere to a stated policy or constraints, like never emit Nazi speech. It cannot even represent that actually inside. A neural net only represents concrete things, cannot represent an infinity like that. And so, abstraction is, even though there's a hope and you see the lack of understanding actually, and somehow in these vectors you have some kind of generalization, but we actually know from the theory of machine learning, there's some epsilon ball kind of, you could say, around the training data, and that's it. So you actually need reasoning to do very far generalization or full abstraction. So so just mathematically, we know that certain things that we want societally are not possible in neural nets alone, right? And those are properties. That's why people are interested in the symbolic stuff. We know that it has those properties.
Yeah, right. Why are they possible with symbolic stuff?
Because like in logic, which is like the main paradigm when we talk about symbolic, but it's not the only one. You can write these statements and like, informally, and you can write a very strict constraint representing, that kind of, do not do this, right? We had a speaker from DARPA yesterday. They're describing a big program just on that that he runs. So you can actually you can represent laws in a very formal way that's, never confuses things, it eliminates ambiguity, and so on. So, we know that the symbolic side has this ability. We know neural nets don't. As Gary said, that the next big problem is how do you get kind of the benefits of what we see with large language models together with the benefits of the symbolic side, and that's what all the research is for. But that's my short answer.
I'll add a kind of like embarrassing codicil to it, which is, I think everything Alexander said is true, but we know how to do this in very formal domains where we can verify things and use certain notations and so forth. So we know that symbolic systems will allow us to state formal constraints that we can follow when they are things like mathematical laws or certain kinds of programming statements and so forth. The place we're really in trouble, and part of why we want Neuro-Symbolic AI, is when we get out to kind of general language about the world, we don't really know how to do that. So in places where we can formalize things, it's actually a very straightforward property of symbolic systems to be able to then put these hard constraints and make them obey. I mean, in some sense, that's what computer programs are. Here's a set of formal rules for governing a database or something like that. Go follow them, and the system will do that. There are even programming formalisms that will allow you to really do it like that. Like Prolog is a little bit like that. But we don't know how to do that in the informal open world. And what large language models have been good at is extracting information from large, complicated worlds where we have a lot of sort of messy data. And we really want to be able to take those two things together. We want to take the formalization and generalization properties. Alex used the word infinity, which I quite like in this context for reasons I won't go into. You want to be able to take that infinity and put it with these complex data sets. And the neural networks are good at the complex data sets, but they're not good at the formal abstractions that we need to do things like verify safety. And so my view, and I think Alex completely agrees, is the only hope we have of doing safe AI, as opposed to these like rogue break-ins every other day, is to push hard on the neurosymbolic stuff. That doesn't mean it's going to come for free or that we can get it tomorrow or anything like that. I think there are a lot of things we need to discover, but that seems like a much more likely avenue than just throwing another neural network, which is what people have been doing for the last 5 years with obviously bad results.
Yeah, and on that front, one of the things that you've frequently said is that there's way too much focus on kind of the outputs of the systems and way too little on the inputs. And with that in mind, and this might be an overly simple question, when you think about the hundred, and anybody who wants to take this, feel free to take it. When you think about the hundreds of billions that we've spent building out the current data center rollout, what kind of how locked in is that hardware? How locked in is that system? If we decide that the symbolic needs a lot more focus, that we need a lot more CPUs, is there a way to adjust the situation? Like, or are these completely lost in sunk costs? And relatedly, there's a question from the audience from Olga V. She said, do you think totally new neurosymbolic hardware may be needed once neurosymbolic approaches become more popular? And so I guess my question is, can we rely on some of what we've already built and adapt it, or is that kind of just
I'd like to
is
hear
what it
Alex's
is?
answer, and I'd like to give my own. You want to go first, and then I'll see if
Yeah.
anything's different.
It's a great question because it looks like we're building it anyway. Maybe
Right.
not all of it. A small amount has been built so far, to my understanding. But let's say we built it all out. Now, here's the thing people should find interesting. We had talks today, and we actually in the Institute are working on things that, because of symbolic properties, could be orders of magnitude more efficient in sample complexity, and that would make a tiny model. And even if you had
Sample complexity basically means like how much data do you need?
how much
So
data,
right
sorry,
now you need the entire internet, and you shouldn't need the entire internet to do many things. Maybe some, but
Right.
not most.
and so that would make suddenly, if depending how soon that happens, we think it could be pretty soon, that could make all of this like, okay, what are you going to compute on all this stuff? Now, that having been said, if there's compute sitting there, and it doesn't even matter the form, it could be GPUs. Just like GPUs were co-opted, they were developed for video games, right? And graphics, and then it got co-opted by AI. We just figured out how do we mash our needs into that form factor. So we're as a researchers are creative, so we'll figure out how to use whatever resource is there if there's giant piles of it, and we'll just do more. So it won't be completely wasted, I would say, but if it's going to be, causing huge problems societally, like climate change, whatever, or sucking all the water out of communities and so on, and we didn't have to build in the first place, that would have been a shame. So, and to answer Olga's question, I think, yes, it turns out that the computations that you would need for on the symbolic side are quite different, actually. You wouldn't have ended up at GPUs. You would have, and it will eventually happen that there will be custom hardware for the symbolic side, and it will look quite different, actually. So in that sense, it will be a waste. We can always co-opt it, and it'll be suboptimal for that new use. So
I'll just put in a word for a paper. Sarah Hooker wrote a wonderful paper called The Hardware Lottery. And the thesis of her paper is we had GPUs, so we built AI out in this particular way. If we'd had some other kind of chip, we might have built AI in some other way. And I think in the long term, we will have many kinds of chips, and we will explore a broader part of the space of the hypothesis space of how you build AI. We're just in this place because we're there. And because it worked a bit, we poured all this money into exploring this tiny space, or really exploiting the space. In fact, there's a common phrase about explore versus exploit. We're not doing that much exploration. We're mostly exploiting. Okay, we have these GPUs. What should we do with them? And we're going to find eventually we don't need as many of them. We can do things more efficiently. We need GPUs and maybe something else for the symbolic stuff. And we'll start to see more approaches as that blossoms.
The only thing I can add here is just my reporting on the current state in data centers, which there are multiple generations of different kinds of chips that companies do use. So, I mean, there are always new chips coming out, and there are also, decades of chips already in use. And it's not like when the new ones come out, they just throw away all the old ones. They're just thinking they need so many that they just add new ones. So you might have kind of like a patchwork in their network. And then I also think a lot of the compute deals are very long term and not realized yet. They might be on a 5, 10, 15, 20-year horizon. And if what you guys are saying happened and there needed to be a big shift in strategy, I think they would make it.
I think they're going to be forced to. One other thing I want to insert is I've always thought about two issues with the neural networks. One is that they're not very efficient. They need a lot of data, a lot of energy, etc. And the other is they're not very good at generalization. It has always seemed to me that the generalization problem is really hard to solve because they just don't represent the right things in order to do the reasoning you need to do. I've always seen them as insoluble. Alex has tried to argue that they're mathematically insoluble. I think that's a little bit too strong, but for practical purposes, they haven't. The optimizations, that's a totally different thing. You know how the computation works. You can find ways to do that computation faster. And what we've seen over the last 5 years is maybe 5 orders of magnitude more efficiency and not that much progress on generalizations, reducing hallucinations, and so forth. I think we will continue to see lots of optimizations. If we see lots of optimizations, we might not need all of those chips. DeepSeek, for example, has already proved that a couple times. That and Kimi has proved that you can do the same computation. Those systems haven't made accuracy better, but they have made efficiency better. We'll see more of that. And then, yeah, these unbuilt data centers, I don't know exactly what's going to happen with them.
And given all of the safety concerns that keep popping up, you often have people saying we need to pause or slow down. I think Gary said that in one of your recent pieces, but I'm curious, like, what is for anybody? What does that look like? Like, if you have Israel that keeps going, if you have China that keeps going, or are they not, like, are there conversations happening like across the world? Because it's not that big of a world. Like, we talk about it as if it's impossible to coordinate this, but on the other hand, we're only talking about a handful of players. But then is there
I think
other people
it's
that are already
unlikely,
outside the
but not
bar?
impossible. I mean, think about how much the Trump administration flipped around with respect to its policy on regulation in a matter of months. They had a wake-up call and they changed, right? You had the Mark Andreessen era and the David Sachs era for the first, year and a half of Trump administration, which was basically no regulation, forget it, we're going to let them run free. And you had people like me saying that might not turn out so well. And then you had the mythos moment, and then you've had all these rogue things in the last 2 months or month, whatever it is. And suddenly the Trump administration, which was as anti-regulatory as anybody in the world, is sitting there making things they don't want to reveal because they're embarrassed about them or whatever the reason is, but making policies so that they can evaluate models to see what the risks are. So that was a complete 180 on their part, right? So if they can 180, so can everybody else and not everybody else was anti-regulatory in the first place. Like, a big myth that I hear over and over again is, well, if we do this, China, they're going to forge ahead and whatever. China actually has more regulation around AI than we do. And China is also concerned about things like cybersecurity. It's not like because China has a different view about democracy or surveillance or whatever, that they want crooks, destroying their banking system. They're very well aware that that could happen, and they're very concerned about it. And so that gives an entree to conversation. I won't say that there's nobody that would play along. I guess, let me see how to put this politely. There are certain countries that have different stability regimes and so forth. I'm trying to hint without saying who I'm talking about, who might want to play differently. But if you're talking about China being with a lot of power, with a lot of AI, with a lot of money, with a lot of citizens, actually wants this stuff to be stable. And that gives them incentive to try to find a regime here, possibly a global regime involving treaties, in which things are stable. They do not want a wildly unpredictable world where any day some, tiny little, not even a country, but just some, person wanting to get rich takes down the world banking system. They don't want that.
I'll just say, well, I'm really curious to hear Emily's thought on, because she closely follows what all different players are doing. But I'll just say, to me, it seems absolutely impossible to expect any kind of pause because there's so much money involved. There's sovereignty, aims involved. It's absolutely unrealistic, and it's just a performative statement by some to say we're going to pause. To me, also just history of science. I mean, everybody's so interested fundamentally in just the science of AI as one of the top, arguably one of the 5 top questions of humanity as a scientific question. There's no way. There's absolutely no way.
Okay, this is the first time I'm going to disagree with you today.
Go for it. Yeah.
And I'll do it on historical precedent, which is with both chemical and biological weapons, we did, in fact, as a society, decide that certain things were taboo. And I won't say that either of them were perfectly 100%, but we did slow them down. We also slowed down nuclear weapons to some extent, not enough. But so, like, I agree with what you said that a lot of it's performative. I agree that there's no way the companies would do this on their own, but I don't think it's completely out of the question. Here will be my scenario. If something really bad happens, probably on the cybersecurity dimension, and then people are forced to, in the way that, like, after banking fell apart, we didn't get as much regulation as I might have liked, but we got some regulation. I think that the chance that some bad cybersecurity event or something like that will happen relatively soon is relatively high, and that's why places like the Trump administration have turned around a bit. And so, like, I don't think it's a sure thing at all. Don't get me wrong, and I don't think a full pause is possible, but I can imagine some degree of slowing down, some degree of disclosure of things beyond what we have now, some degree of mandatoriness beyond what we have now, which is mostly voluntary. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. Part of it comes from history of science, and part of it comes from the pessimism that I do think bad things are going to happen, and bad enough that it forces the governments, especially the democratically elected ones, to do something. And you also have to remember, the United States, most of the public is pretty concerned about AI. That's not necessarily true everywhere in the world, but what moves the U.S. makes have a lot of leverage here, and we have a U.S. government that's actually a little bit more open than it was before.
Mm-hmm. So Emily, the word, yeah, go ahead.
Just to frame your question, just curious, and take it wherever you want, but from your reporting, like, what are the countries besides us that you think would be most resistant? Like, Gary kind of alluded to some, but, like, I'm curious who you think the biggest cowboys are, and in a post-crisis, post-cyber crisis event, where the global public is coming together to say, all right, we're going to not let this happen again, or if it does, it's going to be, we're going to contain it a little bit better. Who are the ones that we need to worry about the most, besides obviously ourselves?
Right. I mean, from my view of the world, it's all about China, especially with the conversation in the past couple of weeks with open source models. So we've mentioned DeepSeek and Kimi, and there's a lot of different models coming out of China that are really on the US's tail and have been discussed in Washington in terms of how do we compete, do we restrain them, and then that secretive framework they're working on is not going to apply to open source. So we're seeing 2 different conversations and 2 different regulatory paths happening. I think the topic that people have been talking about now is not a slowdown or a stop. There was a letter that a bunch of researchers in the industry signed this month, or maybe it was in July. They're calling it pacing the frontier, and that's the word pace that Sam Altman used when reporters were harassing him in Washington in the hallways. He was saying, "Oh, maybe we'll pace." I agree. I think it's completely performative. They want to, I guess, hold hands with China and like go in steps together, and I don't see that happening. I think the market's kind of working at least how it was designed in terms of competition, rising all tides and pushing each other to get better and go faster and further. And unfortunately, with the Hugging Face thing, we have seen it go too fast and commit, crimes essentially. Like hacking is a felony, hacking into another company. Mm-hmm. So it's unclear who is accountable for that, which is a big question. We hear a lot of distancing language from AI companies that say, "Oh, our AIs did this, and we didn't intend, for that to happen." And is it the AI or is it you? You didn't control your experiment. It's like a lab leak. So that's kind of the view of the world as far as I see it.
I'll add one thing on the performative. which is there's definitely an element of that. I don't want you to think that my glasses are too rose-colored. A really good example of that is Dean Ball, who helped construct the White House original policy, the original Trump policy on AI, and then moved to OpenAI. And he just posted something about how, yeah, we'll have a slowdown, but the slowdown will be faster than we are right now. So it's like, like they're positioning themselves like, we won't go infinitely fast, probably because they can't really go infinitely fast. They would if they could, but we'll say a little stuff. So, there's definitely some positioning around the performative stuff. Like, I agree with that. I'm just saying I can foresee a set of circumstances where things might get forced and maybe something actually happens, but for sure some of it is performative.
I thought it was a little bit performative, just because there was no downside to people signing that letter and posting on Twitter, I signed, it's like,
yeah, there have been a million letters like that. Like The
yeah, and it
Economist
was
recently said,
exactly,
like, something bad's going to happen and we hope you'll do something about it, without any
yeah, I mean, I
commitment to
think
like what that would be.
Right, there was no specific ask, convene a meeting with China by the end of the year. There was nothing. So I wasn't very impressed by that. I think it was
I think
more
it's
like,
fair.
I think it's more like, hey, we're gonna get rich off this, and we think that you guys might want to regulate it. So we're just gonna clear our conscience by putting this letter out. And there were really
There's a lot of
serious
that.
researchers on it. That I don't think they were disingenuous. I do think there's an element of, hey, we're not going to solve this problem, whereas there are in other industries, industry groups that come together and convene, in Asia as well, like on cars. There's a lot of like cross country industry groups that meet and say, hey, this is best for our industry. In the long run, what are we going to do to make that happen? They don't put out a vague statement on Twitter and say, hey, the Trump administration, which doesn't want to do any regulation, you should regulate this. It completely fell flat for me.
I'd like to take a question from the chat briefly, because it's very quick to answer. Somebody asked, do I think that formal verification and formal methods should play a role in the neuro-symbolic revolution, or words to that effect? I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think you guys in that community have lots to teach us.
It's already happening.
Yeah,
go for it.
Yeah. On the China question, and I think I read this in Garrison Lovely's new book, Obsolete. I want to check if this is your understanding too, that he made the point that, or he made the case that the Chinese models don't allow the same level of intrusive hacking, just in general. Like, they may allow like the finding of exploits, but they stop them short in a way that the American models don't, and so, which makes the breaking out of the sandbox and getting into another company and stealing credentials and more possible from one of ours. That seems to clash a little bit with what you had said about the ability to draw red lines, not being really part of LLMs.
The only difference like that I can immediately think of actually goes the other way, which is that Hugging Face used Chinese models to defend themselves because they didn't have guardrails that would say, well, I can't do this thing that you want me to try to do. So in that sense, the Chinese models were more permissive than the commercial versions of the American models. There are non-commercial versions of the American models that would be equally permissive, and I think maybe the NSA may have access to them now, for example. I don't know anything that fits with what Garrison said there, but I might have missed something.
I think it might be, Ryan, that, closed models from OpenAI and Anthropic are still the leading, most powerful models in the US, but it's just that DeepSeek, and there's one, Quen or Kimi, these Chinese open source models are just also very powerful and very cheap. So they just get a lot of use. It's like, if you look on sites like OpenRouter, which you can see the most popular models basically by how many tokens that site has processed. You can see that like all the Chinese open source ones are just getting a ton of use because they're cheaper and very powerful. I saw something in the chat, question for Emily. Are there efforts to make the US more competitive in open source? Yes, there are. I think the US did lose the thread for sure. And it was kind of big 2 years ago, and Meta was doing the llama models and they kind of abandoned it. But a company to watch in this space is called Thinking Machines by Mira Murati. She left OpenAI to found this company, and they're aiming to be the best model in the world and make it open weight. OpenAI also has open weight models, but it's not something we're as strong in as China. But there are efforts, and there's certainly, Thinking Machines has boatloads of funding. So yes, it's happening. It's almost like more niche in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I want to actually, for everybody that believes open weight models are somehow great, I want to poke a little hole in that, because open weights doesn't mean it's open source. Like, the source of how you made the model, and including all the little bells and whistles that actually make it work, as we've alluded to, are not seen. But also, it's a giant pile of inscrutable numbers. So you really don't know what's in there, what data it was trained on, and you can't really. It has all the same issues, basically, as what we're saying, all the same mathematical issues. It doesn't follow prompts necessarily that you want, and doesn't reason properly, still hallucinate. So I do agree it's better than closed, but I just want to caution it's not a panacea.
Well, I don't know which one's better. I think there are just different applications, and if you're a business that wants to do tons of customization, you probably would want to use an open weight. If you're like me or anybody else who wants to just use it out of the box, you probably wouldn't do that.
I think these are super complicated issues. I completely agree with what Alex just said, by the way. The other side to it is, like, Carl Zimmer wrote about this in the New York Times, just took an AI system, I don't know the details of how it worked, and built a novel virus. And, we might not want a system like that to be open, because some people might use it to extort governments or individuals, or just cause mayhem so they can short the market or whatever. And so, like, there are lots of reasons to want open weight models, or better yet, as Alex is alluding to, open source, where we actually know what the data is going into it. One of those reasons is for science. If you don't know what the data are going into something, it's very hard to answer these questions about generalization, and very hard to debug things if you don't know the relation between the output and the input. And I think, back to a point you raised earlier about me, the main thing I think I've said is not just that we need to know the inputs and the outputs, but what is inside shaping that. And if we don't know the inputs, then it's very hard to figure that out. So there's every reason to want to have open source, genuinely open source models, but there are reasons to not. And artificial viruses that are outside of the domain that we have worked with before is a pretty good example of that. So I've always found this one to be really hard. My line on this used to be, and I guess I still kind of agree, that you had basically Zuckerberg and Jan LeCun decided to open source or open weight Llama. And that really changed the world. And it should have been a group decision, and not just those two guys sitting in a room thinking, hey, we can recruit people better if we advertise ours as open. Like, it's actually a really hard decision with really strong arguments in both directions. I've never taken a strong stand on it.
So to kind of bring those things together, if it's the case that the LLMs are never going to get to AGI without, bringing in neuro-symbolic symbolism and other elements
and others,
that you talked about, and it's the case that the Chinese versions are much cheaper currently, then it seems like there's the idea, the Americans' idea, that okay, theirs is cheaper now, and we're a little bit ahead, but we're gonna produce the definitive product ourselves. That seems to be a dead end. Are they just completely screwed then? What am I missing?
I mean, I think we the US have backed ourselves into a corner, right? We've put in so much money on the LLMs. We're not going to win. They're not going to be AGI. They might be a component of AGI. Some of that infrastructure may be of some value, but we are not going to outright win that war. You had people, I guess I won't name names, but for several years trying to suggest we were going to win this, that it was a zero-sum game. And it's clear that we're not going to outright win it. The best we can hope for in some ways is sort of like Coke and Pepsi. Like, we have our models, our government uses our models, it doesn't use theirs. They have their models, they don't use ours for at least high security purposes. But that's going to be more like a draw than an outright win. And all of the economics is premised on like a winner take all scenario. Right? Everybody has visions of having the next Google or the next Amazon or the next Facebook, which were basically winner take all. That is not going to happen here, which means that the economics are dubious. And so we're in a position where we are chasing a bet that is very unlikely to pay off. That is just bad. Now, because we're not at AGI, that still allows for innovation. If I were running the country, I would spend much more money trying to foster innovation with tax credits and whatever, research money to try to find alternatives to LLMs that might be stronger. And maybe the AGI race could still be won. I'm not sure it can. I think that we're in an environment where good ideas get spread very quickly. There's probably some espionage element to it. There's certainly a lot of people talking to each other in cafes and whatever. But we're in an era now where nobody holds a lead for more than a month. The biggest leap, I think, was Claude Code, and that leaked. Right? Claude Code was actually an innovation. It was a neuro-symbolic innovation. It was pretty cool. It really did change things. Like December of last year, things started to change. A lot of it was Claude Code, but that code did not stay secure for very long. And so, the only way that somebody's going to get a lasting advantage is if they have some code that they can actually protect well. It's not clear to me that that's possible in the current environment. So I'm actually working on an op-ed basically trying to argue that we should just give up on the zero-sum framing altogether and say, maybe we should collaborate. Maybe we should make AI actually a global good and stop beating our heads over what really is a very low margin business. Like, we're fighting over something that everybody's losing money over. Like, is that really what you want to, where you want to bet your economy on? That seems crazy. Like, maybe we should just collaborate on AI for science. That would be good.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, because I know Emily has to run. Yeah, it's a bit silly to me because what everyone seems to be banking on as far as sovereignty and so on is this tiny moat. It's really tiny, actually, in the big picture of we have more resources than you, because what we're seeing is there's so many companies that can make LLMs and cheaply, and they're all incredibly close now. That moat is like approaching zero.
Dario literally said the moat was our compute, and Google read that and said, "Ha ha ha, we have compute too." And then everybody else it was a crazy idea to say our moat is our compute. Everybody can play that game.
Meanwhile, if people disagree on this, but at least it's our opinion here. Actually, we're very far from AGI. So you're arguing about all this stuff and this tiny disappearing moat when actually this whole big other hidden part of the glacier needs to be worked on to actually get to AGI. So, and AGI is also, furthermore, as Gary said, this is not a secret anybody can keep. Like, so just thinking about this having an edge over others, it's so explosive. AI will dominate all business and everything. So there's no secrets that are going to be possible. So
there's a science fiction-y idea, and not all science fiction ideas are wrong, that there'll be this thing called hard takeoff, and that someone will be able to get such an advantage because they get to AGI a week earlier than everybody else that it will change the world. But I think as a thought experiment, think about GPT-5. The US got to GPT-5 before everybody else. There were literally people panicking and thinking like the world was going to change at that moment. And instead we got it, we got there, whatever, 3 months, 6 months before China. It made no difference in the world at all. There was not hard takeoff just because we got to GPT-5 first. And I can't absolutely rule out that if somebody gets to AGI first, they won't have this insuperable advantage. But I think the more likely thing is other people will be like, oh, I wonder how they did that, and they will copy it, and it will be a briefly held advantage like every model has been, right? Every model since GPT 3.5 or whatever has been a briefly held advantage and not a durable advantage.
It's an extremely small moat and a much harder. If you want a moat, it's actually an intellectual moat, and there's really hard stuff in this symbolic realm that's necessary, and that's more of a moat actually because it's hard. The ideas for LLMs are fairly simple. We literally have undergrads actually doing projects, LLM kind of research. It's in an engineering phase. There's no moat because all the ideas are all the same. So if you want a moat, look to the hard stuff.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Any final thoughts for anyone? I know we've kind of pushing.
I'll go back to Emily's question because I know she needs to go, that she posed earlier. That's still kind of in my head. Like, where are the debates? The debate should be about, is there a moat anywhere to be had, and what else do we need to get to AGI. That's where the debate should be. It shouldn't be, do we need neuro-symbolic AI? That's done. We do need it. Might not be enough. We probably need other good ideas. Maybe it's world models, better reasoning, maybe it's other stuff, continual learning people often talk about, and so forth. That should be where the debate is. What do we need to go beyond this?
And Emily, before you go, just tell people like where they can find you.
Sure. Thank you guys. This is so interesting. I just wanted to do this to get exposure to new ideas and new people. And so I've just been listening to all of you and really appreciate it. So I'm very easy to find. If you want to find me, my email's out there, emily.forlini@fortune.com. My social media is on every platform. So if you want to find me, I'd love to talk to you. And yeah, you guys are all really great. It's just cool to talk about alternatives and work through these ideas. So I thought this was awesome. Yeah. Right. Should I step out, or do you guys want to keep talking, or should?
No, I think we can end.
Sure. I guess the last question for me would be, what is the Steelman case for why on earth it wouldn't go exactly as Gary says, that somebody develops AGI and then a few weeks or a few months later they copy it and they have it too? Like, that seems to me to be so obvious as to be almost a guarantee. But like, what is there a case for why that might not be? Because if there's no case for why that isn't, then we're doing everything wrong, to Gary's point.
The science fiction version is, you have this AGI system and it is so smart that it outwits everybody else, makes many copies of it, self-improves it. Recursive self-improvement is the big phrase now. And it just gets, moves so far, so fast that nobody can catch up. I mean, that's the argument. And it's very popular in the doomer community. But I think the doomer community wants to believe that we are at literally existential risk in order to justify what they're doing. I think they don't have to frame things that way, but that is the way that they have chosen to frame things, is that we are literally at existential risk, that we will not be able to stop the machines because they move so fast. Like, if you read Eliezer Yudkowsky and Nate Suarez's book, If Anybody Builds It, Everybody Dies, it's framed in exactly that way, with this kind of strong takeoff or fast takeoff kind of assumption. So they want to believe that. In my review in the TLS, I said, it might not actually work that way. Like, if the machines get smarter than us, we'll probably actually have some time to respond. They don't want that to be part of the argument because it undermines the value or whatever, the intellectual place of what they're doing. But that would be where the argument would live, is that you get this magic thing and nobody can keep up with you. I just think that that's too much of an idealization of the real world. In the real world, you have espionage, you have reverse engineering. It takes time to put things into practice. So, like, look, the basic idea of LLMs was from 2017, and for that matter, of neural networks was from the 1950s. It took a long time to put it into practice where it really worked. I mean, we still haven't got LLMs to not hallucinate, right? And, we've been working on this for a long time. So the idea, even if I thought AGI was a single formula, which is ridiculous. I think it's actually many things. And I came up with that formula today. It still wouldn't mean that I can take over the world tomorrow. That's insane. I mean,
since we want to close, I'll just add one line to that, which is maybe that runaway scenario could happen, but not with this AI. This AI is too primitive.
People certainly not with this AI. No way.
Limits. That's all. But it doesn't even have the abstraction to improve itself. So it doesn't have the world model to improve itself. So no need to fear about this version of AI. There are other things to fear with this AI, but not that super intelligence. No.
Agreed.
Right. Well, thank you guys for inviting me. I really appreciate it as well. Alex, if you had any final
Emily and Ryan, thank you so much. It was a great honor.
Thank you.
You're both so accomplished, and we're a bunch of geeks here. We're starting to get a lot of attention, and in a way, I do want to bring to light this set of techniques. So I'm glad we're starting to get real people like you both to take a little look at what we're doing.
I have a last word, which I'm stealing from somebody else who works in the verification community. I'm basically stealing his idea, which is, hey, all you out there in the audience, we can't actually see you because of how this is configured, but I love what you're doing, and your world's about to change, because Nobody has paid attention to what you were doing. You were working on something that was really not very popular for a long time. And I'm proud of you that you did that. I'm glad that you did it. It's going to suddenly get much more popular. You're going to have a bunch of grifters claiming that they know about Neuro-Symbolic AI who don't really. Like, your world is about to change. Keep doing what you're doing and don't let that bother you.
Good message. All right. Thanks again, Ryan and Emily. And Gary, good to see you as always.
Thanks,
Great.
Alex and
Great
Ryan.
conversation.
Gary.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, it's great.
Thanks.
All right. Maybe I'll just close up the whole event with a few quick words. All right. We have our closing slide here. So let me just thank everyone for an amazing event and all the interest. Check out our new website. You can actually learn Neuro-Symbolic AI through our, at least somewhat, through our learning site. We keep threatening to make a real course, which we will one of these days soon. And all of you with Neuro-Symbolic open source projects, we want to make your project easy to find. So check out our BYOP, Bring Your Own Project effort. Check us out on YouTube. We suddenly exploded to 15,000 subscribers, I'm told. And we'll be sending out a survey, so thanks in advance for giving us a little info. Help us design the next event better. Check out Valency. It's a tool for researchers. The whole point of this event, our big point of it, is to help researchers create the next wave of AI. And Valency can help, possibly, so check it out. So, all right, and till next time, stay with us on our different channels, and we'll maybe be having a next event even before the summer school. So see you all then, and take care, everyone.